I would like to welcome all of you to the John Goldstein Memorial Lecture in Environmental Economics. And so I would like to welcome our live audience, as well as those that are watching this event through Zoom online. And momentarily, I will introduce our speaker, but I will just say a little bit about a new format that we are trying out, and hopefully works well, is this is going to be it's a real important topic, right? The political economy of environment, and especially all the things happening, right? The big political whirlwinds. And so we're expecting that the audience will have questions. And so the way we're going to do it this time is we're going to do it, you can submit them through your phones. And so all of you who have registered, both in person or Zoom, got an email with that you can click on and submit a question. And for those of you in the live audience, if you didn't register but you're here, you can just over there you could look at that QR code, and that will pop up the website where you could submit the question. And in addition to our speaker, we will have a panel, which will all be online and we moderated by Jessica Donahue. And so she will really be moderating the event, and we have some graduate students helping out processing the questions. And so we have a lot to do. And so let's just get right into it. And again, welcome to the John Goldstein Memorial Lecture. And this is really one of the special events we have here at the Department of Economics at Minnesota. And when we do this, we honor John Goldstein, an environmental economist who was very, very far ahead of his time. And I especially want to welcome some of his family members who I think will be watching on Zoom. And the title of today's talk, The Economics of Conservation, well, that was right down the wheelhouse of John Goldstein. And just a little while ago, I was looking at one of his treatise on wetlands conservation, and like page 5, The Economics of Conservation. And so we couldn't be more pleased that today's speaker is Bård Harstad. Now, Bård is on the faculty at Stanford, where he is the, let me see, I've got it here, the David S. Lobel Professor in Business and Sustainability and Professor of Political Economy at Stanford. And before that, he was at Northwestern, before that at Oslo. And one of the things I want to emphasize here is economics of environment. Last time we talk about, oh, let's put a tax on carbon. Well, sometimes maybe that's the easy thing. How does that happen? It's the challenging issue about how to deal with these political economy issues. And we are so lucky to have one of the world-renowned thinkers in this area to give us this lecture. So let's give a warm welcome to Professor Bård Harstad.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So now something magic is supposed to happen, that you can hear me suddenly on the microphone. Is it on? Yeah, great. Wonderful. I didn't do anything about that, but thanks. Okay, so it's great to be in Minnesota. I've never been here, actually. But this is a picture from Minnesota, and this is from 125 years ago, and this is my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather, he was here to cut down trees for a while before he went back to Norway. And now I'm here again to make up for it. Okay. So you cannot see it, but it's a very old picture. But sometimes when I'm defining the field of economics of conservation, I say that it's the economics of doing nothing. Which is in contrast to most of economics, which is about doing very many different things, and for example, investing and making sure that there's economic growth. But economics of conservation is the economics of making sure that not too much is happening. And I think it might sound a bit like a boring field, like if nothing happens, a bit conservation. But I think it's increasingly important. I think it's going to be increasingly important for environmental problems. of many different types. And today I will talk a little bit about why and for which things and what challenges that we will face when it comes to economics of conservation. And also I will speculate about solutions. And so I will not talk about a particular paper of mine, but I will talk about several, so to give a bit more broader presentation. So I think the economics of conservation is going to be important for many fields, including, for example, climate change. So this is from a paper by Belsby et al., I think in Nature, or was it Science, where they calculate how much of the fossil fuel that must be conserved in order to reach the target of 1.5 degrees Celsius in a cost-effective way. In a cost-effective way, that means that you would like to keep in the ground those fossil fuels which are anyway costly to extract or which are contributing a lot to climate change. So then you can see that yellow means that you should keep most of it in the ground. So in particular, coal, you can see that most of the coal should be left in the ground if it should reach 1.5 degree in a cost-effective way. And you can see that how much of different fuels that should be left in the ground depends on the country and where in the world it is. And one place where it's reasonable that you should conserve a lot is in the Arctic. So this is a map of the globe from the north. So you can see the Arctic on the middle here. And that is a place where it's especially important to keep fossil fuel in the ground because it's very costly to extract it. So it contributes equally much to climate change as if you extract oils elsewhere, but it's very costly to extract it in addition. So that is where if you want to keep fossil fuel in the ground in a cost-effective way, then we must start there to conserve. And it's also a good candidate because there are many different countries who are claiming the right to extract from the Arctic. And some of these claims are, as you may know, overlapping, which means that we do not know yet who is going to get the right to extract from the North Pole, for example. There are several countries who claim that right. And this uncertainty in who is going to get the right is combined with uncertainty regarding what is left in the ground. And this uncertainty means that it can be possible, in fact, to make an agreement about a moratorium and not extracting from the Arctic. And that can be easier to achieve now than at a later point in time in the future when we know exactly who is getting the right to extract from the most profitable places. Because at that point, the heterogeneity between the countries will be so large that it will be difficult for them to make an agreement. So that is one possible solution to conserve resources. But what is that a solution to? Well, it could be a solution to something we call carbon leakage. And carbon leakage would mean that it's difficult for a country to conserve by itself. So you might need, or one solution to carbon leakage is that you might want to have a coalition of countries of several producers who are conserving, for example, in the Arctic, all together. Because otherwise we can have carbon leakage. And what is carbon leakage? Well, carbon leakage is that if I cut back on my emissions, someone else will emit more. That happens both on the demand side, but also on the extraction side, on the production side. And we can, and this is a simple way of illustrating them, which we often use in economics, where we have the demand curve, which is going down like this, indicating that if the price is low, people will buy more fossil fuel. But the supply curve goes up, meaning that if the price is high, then they will produce more fossil fuel. And then you have an equilibrium where supply is equal to the demand, and that determines the price of energy or fossil fuel in the world, or for example, oil, or which depends on the quantities, here coal actually. So if you see from this diagram, suppose that this total supply consists of two things: how much we are producing in my home country and how much the rest of the world will produce. That the sum of those supplies leads to the total supply in the world. And what happens now if my country, if I'm the domestic country, if I cut back on my production? Well, what will happen is that the total supply, which consists of my supply and the other supply, that will shift left. That will shift left in this way, and that means that the new price where those two curves cross, that will be a higher price than before. If I produce less, the price will go up. And the higher price means that those outside of my country, they will find it optimal to produce more. And that is carbon leakage on the supply side. They will produce more because I produce less. And to some extent, that will discourage me from doing any action because I know that they will undo, at least they will undo a part of my action. So that's and then one possible solution, which I've discussed elsewhere, is maybe you can buy coal. So by buying coal, I was thinking about, suppose that all these different supplies, they can come from different places, different reserves, different coal mines, and different coal mines have different costs of production. Some of them have a low cost, and they will be produced from even if the price is very low. But other coal mines or reserves have a higher cost to extract from, and they will be supplied to the market only if the price is higher. And that is why the supply curve is increasing. And that means that some of these reserves, they are just so costly. I don't have a light on this, but they are so costly that they're almost the same as the price of energy or the fossil fuel in the market. And that means that those reserves are not very profitable because the cost of extracting from those can be very close to the price for some of them. That's what we could talk about that's the marginal reserves. And one possibility to avoid to get around this carbon leakage problem that I mentioned could be that you pay for the right to extract from those marginal reserves, so that they are not allowed to extract from those places anymore. If you do that, then you can make sure that even outside of your country or your coalition, there will be conservation of resources because you're paying them to conserve. And what will happen in this diagram is that basically you are going to remove the coal mines which are having those extraction costs which are very close to the equilibrium price. You are removing them from the market. And that will change the supply curve. It will not look like this anymore. It will shift back, it will shift in like this. There will be no longer, after you have purchased the right to extract them, there will be no longer any reserves which has a marginal cost, which is, so that that is close to the price. They have been removed from the market if you pay the owner to not extract. And this new supply curve, after you have taken them out of the market, means that if the price changes, the total supply will not change. It will not change because you have removed those coal mines, which are opened if the price is high, but closed if the price is low. Those coal mines have been removed from the market, and that means that carbon leakage is actually reduced or eliminated, is removed. The carbon leakage will not longer be there in the sense that if the price goes up a little bit, it will not be the case that the coal mines will be opened because you already paid the owner to conserve those reserves. And because carbon leakage is now reduced, it will also be the case that if I in my country reduces my own extraction, the old concern was that the other countries will extract more, but that concern now is weakened because I have already paid them to not extract. So that means that not only will they extract less, but also my own conservation of resources will have a bigger impact because carbon leakage is removed or weakened. So that is also one reason for why conservation of resources can be effective to deal with carbon leakage. Yeah, so that's one possible solution. But this thing about conserving resources is not only important when it comes to fossil fuel, but also when it comes to, for example, forest conservation. When it comes to forest conservation, then you have different suppliers who are providing, for example, beef and soybeans or timber to the same market. So they're both supplying to the same market. And that means that you get leakage, not carbon leakage, but you get deforestation leakage. So now it will be the case that, for example, if one of them decides to conserve more forest, the concern is that the neighbor, will extract more timber, will extract more. So then again, you get leakage. And why is this happening? Well, because if one of them supplies less agricultural products or timber to the market, to the common market, the prices go up. And that motivates the neighbor to produce more. So some of the conservation is now undone. Again, it's leakage. So, and of course, that type of leakage, conservation leakage, can reduce the efficiency of the payment for ecosystem services, PES program, or RED program, which is a UN program standing for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. So that will reduce the efficiency of that, and that, of course, will discourage country from doing that, from conserving, because other countries will undo it. So another solution to this, which is very often used, is that if, and that solution can be especially effective if these are different districts, and that is to provide an incentive for them to conserve together. Like, for example, suppose that instead of having conservation agreements by paying each district to conserve, you pay instead the national government, who will then have the task to motivate them to conserve. So, and in fact, that is typically how these RED plus agreements that I mentioned typically work. Norway, for example, is spending money on forest conservation, and they always target and deal with the national government because they are worried about the leakage effect that would arise if they have agreements with different districts. But of course, you can have a trade-off. There can be other reasons why you should deal with it, why you should have agreements with the districts. And then, for example, the last president of Brazil before Lula was Bolsonaro, and he was not a good negotiation partner for the Norwegian rainforest initiative. So they didn't make any agreement and no payment. But it was considered to instead have agreements with the local district. So there can be situations where there's a trade-off. But to deal with carbon leakage, it's typically important that you target kind of the national government or the highest level that you can. So basically, when we are talking about all this, then we are messing with the property rights a little bit, right? Because we are paying, and we are talking about paying someone to not use the right they have to extract natural resources. And sometimes that can be viewed as an innovation into national sovereign rights. But then could ask, whose land is it anyway? Property rights are not inalienable. They are, and they've never been. They are a creature of society and evolve with the changing nature of society. And that is a quote from John Goldstein, who wrote this in a paper 30 years ago. So now, basically, now we'll think a little bit more about how these payments will work and what other challenges they will that we will face beyond leakage. Okay, so to do this, suppose that there is the North, who it can potentially pay the South to not extract a resource, for example, not log. The amount of payment is some number P, and the B is the benefit for the South if you extract the resource. They get a benefit because you can use the land for agricultural products, or they can sell the timber, or they can please the farmers or the lobby groups or something like this. And that's the benefit B. But there is a cost for the North, because they lose biodiversity, the homes of indigenous people, or they will lead to more carbon emissions. And that total loss is represented by some number or parameter C. And if C is larger than B, that means that the cost of deforestation is larger than the benefit. So ideally, you should not deforest. And that can be possible to implement if there is a price P, which is larger than the benefit B, but smaller than the cost C, which the North is paying to the South in return for conservation. So in that case, both of them will benefit. And one way of illustrating this is the following. So suppose that the South is making a decision, okay, to log or to not log. And if you don't log, then none of them get any payoff because there is no action at all. But if the south decide to log, then the north is losing, getting a loss represented by this cost of deforestation. But the benefit B goes to the south. So that's the second after the comma. That's the second. That's the benefit for the south. So before this, the north can pay an amount, a price P, to the south. And if that is accepted by the south, then the payoff for the north is now that it loses that P, because that's what you pay to the south, but the south is getting that P. And you can see that if the P is between B and C, then this outcome is better for both parties than that outcome. And this means that they will make an agreement and they will find a way to conserve. And that is basically in a very simple form. This is like a game tree, which this is one way to illustrate the payment for ecosystem services program, but also RED Plus that I mentioned earlier. And it's also related to the Coase theorem, which you might have heard about, where and the Coase, Ronald Coase, got the Nobel Prize for, among other things, this contribution, where he showed that environmental problems can be solved by the parties if they negotiate with prices in this way. But of course, this simple game tree is not super realistic, because in reality, there's not only 2 stages and then the game is over, but it goes on and on and on. And one way of capturing that, the fact that we have a long time horizon in reality, is to expand on this game tree a little bit in this way. So now I may extend it a little bit. Now, first the north is deciding whether to pay or not. And if you're not paying, the south is deciding on whether to log or conserve. But after that, you come into the next year, and the same thing is going on. If the south has conserved, then north has once again an opportunity to pay. But if north is not paying, the south has an opportunity to log. And if the south logs, the game is over. There is nothing more to negotiate. But if the south decides to conserve, then we enter the next period, which is just continuous like this forever, right? So now, when you expanded that game tree in this way, then it makes clear that if the south, so look at the first time the south is making a decision whether to log or not, then it depends on what the south believes will happen later. If the south believes that if you conserve, well, maybe north will pay, then it makes sense to even if you can log now and get benefit B, if you think that if you conserve, then north is going to pay you P. And if P is larger than benefit B, then south is willing to conserve, hoping that the north will pay. So that can happen. So even if the north does not pay, if the south believes that the north will pay eventually, and then you get P, and if P is larger than B, that is better for south than to cut the forest. But of course, if that logic holds, the north will not need to pay, because if the north understands that, well, the south is going to conserve anyway, because the south thinks that it will be paid and compensated for conservation, then south is going to conserve, and then the north will think that, well, in that case, I may not need to pay, right? But of course, if it's not credible that the north will pay, because the north will just not pay, then the south will log. Because the south is better to get the benefit B than to get nothing at all. So if the south believes that north will not pay, then the south will log. But if that is a credible, if the south will log, then of course then the north will hurry up and pay. So that's a contradiction, right? Or almost like a paradox. If the north will pay, S will. If the north will not pay, the S will log. But if S logs, north will pay. So you're getting a circle, right? And this means that if you look on this game and try to make a prediction of what happens, you don't know for sure. You cannot make for sure. You cannot say that, this forest is going to be conserved. Because if that was the prediction, then north will not need to pay, because the south understand the south will then conserve in order to get the payment in the future. So that cannot be happening for sure, certain. If you don't know, like in economics, we will say that there is a mixed strategy equilibrium. It may be that the North will not pay, and that the forest will be logged and chopped down. So that is kind of one way of thinking about this is that the North cannot make it credible that it will pay in the future. If it's trusted that it will pay, the more it is trusted that the North will pay in the future for conservation, the stronger is the temptation to not pay at all. Because if it's trusted, the South will pay as conserve, waiting for that payment to come. So the more you are trusted, the more you have an incentive to not pay. So that's a kind of a problem, and one reason why we cannot expect this to work necessarily. So it's very important that this payment for the North to succeed with conservation is very important that it's credible. Okay. Another problem is that there are many, it's not only the North. There are many countries who would benefit from conservation of biodiversity or keeping the forest and the carbon in the rainforest, for example. There are many who would benefit from that. And that means that economists would say that the conservation is there for public good. If you are paying for conservation, I benefit because the biodiversity is conserved, and that is beneficial also for me. So then basically, I might hope that someone else, another country, will pay instead of me. So if you have many northern countries who all benefit, if there's, for example, Brazil is conserving forest, then they have an incentive to free ride on each other and hoping that someone else will pay instead of me. And that hope might mean that in this type of game, each of them, for example, my country, would be less inclined to pay right away because I might want to wait and see if someone else is paying instead. And this means that if all the northern countries are willing to wait and see and hoping that someone else will pay instead, the probability that the South will cut the forest will increase. So the more northern countries who benefit from conservation, the less likely it is that the forest will actually be conserved, because they will all hope that someone else instead of them will pay. So that's a problem, because that means that the more important it is to conserve, because many northern countries really benefit from keeping the biodiversity or the carbon in the forest. The more of them who benefit from that, the harder it will be to actually conserve, because they will all hope that someone else will pay instead of them. So that's one challenge about free riding. And another challenge that I would like to highlight, and of course all these challenges implies that they can contribute to an explanation for why we have not succeeded enough with conservation so far. And that those explanations are necessary before we can think about solutions. So another challenge is that the government who are making those decisions to log or not log at different times, they are different. It's not the same government all over this. Like there can be different governments. So there might be a different government in power in 2029 than in 25. Let's hope so. And if a future government is expected to log, that will influence what earlier governments will do. So, for example, if the future government, one of the future governments is expected to log, then if I'm today's representative in the government, then I will be less inclined to conserve. Because if I conserve and if I think that the next government is going to log anyway, then I might log then I might allow for logging right now instead of letting the next government capture the benefit of extracting the resource. So the more I think that next governments or other governments are going to extract the resource, the more I'm tempted to extract myself instead. So those beliefs about what later governments will do, they will have a big impact on what today's government will do. And that will lead to basically something like a domino effect. If I think that this government will extract, well, then the next government will also extract, because why should I leave all the cake and the surplus to that government? So they will extract, but if that government is extracting, then also the government in 29 will extract, and then I will just extract right away. So there will be a domino effect where you get a lot of extraction right away, if you think that someone in the future will extract. But this also have a positive side, right? Because if it's believed that future governments will conserve, if it's believed that, no, there is a reason to think that these governments will conserve that the resource instead of extracting the resource, then also the next government will be more inclined to conserve, because it's worthwhile to conserve if that government will also conserve. And if that government conserves, then also the government in 29 will find it more worthwhile to conserve if it's believed that later governments will also conserve, and that will lead to immediate conservation already today. So that is what I call a conservation multiplier. That's a positive domino effect. That if you think that future governments are more likely to conserve, that will lead to more conservation already today. And this multiplier is especially large if the current government is paying a lot of attention to what future governments will do. And that will be the case if the future governments is likely to be different from, if you are likely to lose power so that someone else will be in power in the future, or if there is a disagreement between different political parties, or if you really dislike that the next government will spend the money or spend the revenues from extraction on things they like instead of spending the money yourself. If those things are present, then the multiplier will be very strong, in the sense that if you think that the next government will extract, then you rather extract right away. And similarly, if you think that future governments will conserve, you are more inclined to conserve today. So this conservation multiplier can basically be exploited by the North, who would like to have conservation, because if it's expected, even if the North is not paying right away, if it's expected and if it's credible that the North is going to pay that government in the future to conserve, because it has tied its hand to do it, or because there is an international agreement so that to make sure that the North is going to pay future governments who conserve, that makes it more worthwhile for the government in 2023 to also conserve, because they will not extract the resource. And if the government in 2033 is also more likely to conserve, the government before that will also conserve. So that then you get immediate conservation, even if the payment is coming much later. So the problem is that this exploiting the conservation multiplier can be done not only by the North, who would like to conserve, but also by lobby groups, for example, who prefer to have extraction. How? Well, suppose that there is a lobby group, and there are such lobby groups. For example, in Brazil, there is a lot of agricultural associations. There is a big agricultural association who is lobbying the government to get access to forest that it can log and develop into agriculture. And if the current government expects that in the future that lobby group is going to persuade the government to extract the resource and to allow for logging, that makes it less worthwhile for the government in 2033 to conserve, because it's not going to be conserved forever. And when the government in 2033 are not conserving, the government in 29 will not conserve either. And in fact, if I'm the government today, I will also be more inclined to extract the resource. So that would mean that the lobby group who are threatening, or who is expected to lobby a future government to get access to the land, will get that access right away because of this domino effect. So not only can a North exploit this conservation multiplier, but also a lobby group who prefer to get extraction. and access to the land. And they are not similar. So there is an asymmetry between them, between the two. There is an asymmetry between North, who would like to pay for conservation, and the lobby group, who would prefer to get access to the land. And that asymmetry is that basically the lobby group, who prefer to get access to the land, only needs to win this game once. Like, you only need to persuade the government to get to be allowed to extract one single time. But if you need to conserve, you have to conserve every time. You have to win every time. So you must make sure that you are conserving at the top, and every government must conserve. And that's kind of an asymmetry between those who would like to extract, who would basically need access once, versus the North here, who would prefer to have conservation, who must succeed every time. And this asymmetry means that the outcome of this game is typically favoring the lobby group who prefer extraction. And that is a challenge. So one possible here is that maybe we can conserve by lending, and that is well, I'll come to that soon. And that is also dealing with a problem which is that if the North pays today to the South to conserve, it might be possible, of course, in this game that in the future the South will log anyway. It might not be enough to pay only once and then again. For example, Ecuador was getting payments to conserve, but Ecuador later decided to allow for more logging anyway. So it's always possible that you pay, but then the South will extract. So one way of dealing with that problem is to give a loan for conservation. Suppose that the North can give us the South a loan today in 2025, and that loan must be repaid only when the South is increasing logging. So then you will maintain the motivation to conserve, well, not only in 2025, but also the next government will have a motivation to conserve, because otherwise it must be repaying that debt. So that could be a way to make sure that the government will continue to have incentive to conserve. Because the loan will make it costly for future governments to allow for more logging when they have to repay that loan. And the current government is glad that future governments will be more likely to conserve. So because of that happiness, this type of compensation scheme can conserve more per dollar for the North than the typical REDD+ contract which is just a payment, which I described earlier. So this type of loan, conservation by giving a loan, is different from something you might have heard about, which is debt for nature swaps and green bonds. Because debt for nature swaps, that is also relying on the credibility for the South to continue to conserve after you have forgiven the debt. And that may not happen. So I mentioned Ecuador, for example, where they were forgiven a loan, but later relaxed some of the conservation laws, nevertheless. So this is instead related to something which is called sustainability-linked bonds. And differently from these green bonds, the funds for these sustainability-linked bonds are not tied and earmarked for a particular purpose, but instead the interest rate on the loan is linked to the sustainability performance of some indicator, for example, deforestation levels. But these sovereign sustainability-linked bonds have been relatively slow in taking off. They are not so famous as the green bonds. So far, only Chile and Uruguay have issued these sustainability-linked bonds. But Brazil has also been discussing them, and there is a reason to believe that not only Chile and Uruguay, who issued the sustainability-linked bonds in 2002, will continue to do that, but maybe other countries will do that too. But there are, of course, challenges with this kind of loans. Because what if the South does not repay? So if you give a loan, and we're hoping that that will motivate the South to conserve, if the deal is that they have to repay the loan if it starts to deforest. But of course, maybe the South will deforest and not repay the loan. That's a possibility. Maybe the South defaults, right? Or maybe the forest burns. Maybe the South tries to conserve the forest, but it fails. So that is some of the challenges. And that is something we have to think harder about, with, which I'm doing with Kjetil, who is here in Minnesota. So to keep you updated on that part of the progress, you can always consult with Kjetil. Another challenge, in fact, with all of what I've talked about so far, is that it might be difficult for the North to come up with the liquidity, to the money, the cash, which is necessary to conserve, to pay the South to conserve. Because you have to compensate the South for conservation, but it might be difficult to come up with the cash. And then the question, what can you do instead? Maybe you can use a trade agreement. Because international trade agreements and to get access to a market in a different country is something every country is eager to get. They would very much like to get access, for example, to the market in Europe for their beef produced in Brazil, if they can. So that's a kind of a carrot that you might be possible to use to motivate conservation if you don't have enough cash. So because trade, international trade and conservation of trees are anyway relatively closely related, in a sense that traditional free trade agreements, which opens up for free trade and that allows, for example, Brazil to get access to a bigger market, that has been shown that that can lead to deforestation because it leads to a bigger market for beef, for example, and that can lead to more deforestation. There are several empirical papers, which studies, who shows that there might be such a link. And not only that, but also after deforestation has taken place, then there will be more beef and agricultural products to sell, and that will also raise the demand for more international trade. And therefore, it will lead to more bigger demand for free trade agreements. So there can be a cycle where free trade leads to more deforestation, and more deforestation leads to more agricultural products, which raises the demand for free trade again. So they are linked. And one way of thinking about this is to think about the gains from international trade, measure for the North on the horizontal axis and for the South on the vertical axis. And if you are a particular place on that line, then you have pinned down both the gains for the North and the gains for the South. And the reason why you have many different ways of splitting the gains from trade is because you can make a trade agreement which includes many products or a subset of the products, and it can include quotas or maybe even tariffs on some goods and not on other goods. So by discussing all the details of a trade agreement, the countries are basically deciding and negotiating how they should split the gains from trade. So there are many different ways they can split the gains from trade. And one hope or possibility is that you can make the way you are splitting the gains from trade, where you are in the point green, which is very beneficial for the South. You can see that if you have a trade agreement which leads to the green point, that leads to a lot of gains from trade for the South, not so much for the North. But if you are instead on this point red, that gives a bigger gains from trade for the North, but not as much for the South. And then the countries are negotiating where they should be on that line. But it might also be possible to say that, well, let's start out at the green point, but if there is deforestation, we are moving to the red point, right? So that would mean that, for example, you start out where in a green agreement where there is maybe no tariff on beef coming from Mercosur or from Brazil, But if Brazil starts to deforest a lot, then you will raise the tariffs. And then you move to a different type of trade agreement, which is characterized by the red point. If that kind of change is expected as a consequence of deforestation, then you can see that the South might prefer to stay at the green point, even if that means that you need to conserve forest. So that is what I call a contingent trade agreement. You make the details of the trade agreement, whether you are at the point green or the red point, make that contingent on how much the South is deforesting. So that is basically what I will talk about tomorrow in an economic seminar in more detail about this contingent trade agreement. Okay, so with this, I was just going to sum up and maybe move to the discussion. I don't have a watch, maybe, but yeah. So yeah, so this is John Goldstein, and here are some of the papers that I have briefly been circulating in this discussion. Thank you.
Okay, so the next step is magically, yes, here the magic is happening.
So should I sit?
Yes, please.
Hello, everyone. We're very happy that you could join us for the talk just now, and it's certainly covered a lot of ground. So we're looking forward to our panelists being able to, I think, add some context here based on their perspectives. And I'm going to just briefly introduce both of our panelists and myself. I'm Jessica Chernholm-Donahue. As you might imagine, all three of us are Minnesota grads. So we all have our PhD from Minnesota, and very, very happy to be here with you for this lecture. I want to introduce Bob Litterman. I'm sure many of you know Bob, founding partner at Kapos Capital, also chairman of the Risk Committee and Climate Policy. Prior to joining Kapos and founding Kapos, Bob was at Goldman Sachs for over 23 years. It brought to multiple innovations to the market during that time, and he's also served on numerous boards, including the World Wildlife Fund, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the Climate Leadership Council. And Bob's quite passionate about market mechanisms for sustainability. So excited for his comments. And then also Richard Sandor, who is the chairman and CEO of the American Financial Exchange, the founder of the Chicago Climate Exchange, and which is the world's first exchange for trading all 6 greenhouse gases. He's been honored with numerous awards, including Hero of the Planet and Hero of the Environment, and has held academic positions in several prestigious universities. So I'm going to take a moment now to turn it over to Richard to just give us some comments. And when Richard's finished, Bob, if you would also give some comments on the lecture, that would be great. Richard?
Yeah, the first thing I'd like to say is that John would be very proud of the lecture that Bart just gave, and really satisfies. And I know Anne and Julia, his wife and daughter, are probably listening, and I know they would feel equally proud in what has been accomplished. And my wife Ellen and I are so proud of the Department of Economics and the fellow panelists here in the talk that Bart did. So forgive that personal diversion, but it's important to John's memory, and that's why Ellen and I sponsored this, and he is smiling somewhere in the heavens. The talk is really, I thought, extraordinarily interesting. It's interesting in the sense because when John and I were fellow students 65 years ago, or 63 years ago at the University of Minnesota, We basically talked about issues like that. But then, Bob, at those times, it was really present value. That was the only context that we had for looking at these problems. And I listened to this conversation, and it's phenomenal, the range of tools that economists have to deal, including game theory, with issues that we looked at only in the time value of money. So, you know, the expanse of the profession is likely a enormous benefit to looking at policy problems like this. The talk is great. It was very, very well done. I will make one or two observations that Bård might want to think of. So we worked, my colleagues and I, on the design of the SO2 program. And because of the negotiations, and we actually did, Bård, the first trade of SO2 allowances registered in the EPA SO2 registry. And at that time, the acid rain program was divided into two phases. It was passed in the Clean Air Act in 1990. And I'll be done in 2 minutes and then respond if anybody is interested. And then a phase in 95 to 2000, a subsequent phase. So we had the same issues about emitters and people who bought SO2 credits under the allowance and program. And there was fear that the program would be manipulated by politicians or not honored for different Democratic or Republicans, depending they did. And Bård, what we did, and we did the same thing with carbon trades, we just did 30-year trades. And we bought the entire reductions that would be established. And in this case, it was the seller of a municipality. And we tied it to make sure it was an evidence of default if the allowances weren't, so their credit rating would be impacted. So the first thing that you might want to think about is to model it for longer time periods that go over election cycles so that there is a binding agreement, number one. Number two, somehow tie it to the credit rating of the country, which we did. And third of all, in the work we did at the Climate Exchange, in the best of all worlds, although it would be an enormous challenge, is make the obligation contingent and a liability of the central bank, because central bank defaults would wreck a country. And to make the credit tied to the credit worthiness of the central bank as opposed to the government, you'd have a different default scenario. And the last thing is to somehow include transaction costs, because in doing this for 45 years, my biggest expenses are legal. And the gains from trade, obviously, as we know, and you bring out, certainly are often diminished by the legal costs of contracting. And those become a hurdle to trade, and somewhere in that you might want to consider that. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you, Richard. Wonderful. Bob, I'll turn it to you, but I just want to remind the audience, both in the room and on Zoom, to please use the QR code to submit questions if you can. On Zoom, I think you can put it in the chat as well, but we prefer if you use the QR code. So just a reminder there. Bob, turning it to you.
Thank you, Jessica. And I want to agree with Richard. I thought this was a terrific presentation. It raised a lot of really important issues. And in particular, I think it's very relevant to the types of conservation projects that are going on. I've been serving on the board of the World Wildlife Fund now for about 15 years, and we got involved in the Brazilian rainforest protection way back. I think the first proposal was in 2002, so it's been several decades. And there's something there called the Amazon Regional Protected Area, ARPA. And it started out as kind of this year-to-year funding of conservation that's not very effective. And then over time, it developed into what we now call Project Finance for Permanence, PFPs, where instead of going year to year, you bring together a group of funders, also a group of stakeholders. In his discussion, Bård talks about the North funding the South, but of course, really, it's much more complicated. And you've got the government, you've got local communities, you've got conservation community, domestic conservation groups, as well as lobbyists that Bård talked about that want to exploit the land. So how do you get this all put together? And it's something that we've been working on at World Wildlife Fund, again, under the idea of creating permanence and bringing together the funders and so on. So I'd be interested if Bård has anything to say about some of these projects that have been put in place to try and fund conservation, not only in the Amazon, but also in Colombia, Peru, Bhutan, and other countries. But again, I thought it was terrific, raised some really important questions, and highlights the difficulties associated with conservation goods. Of course, as I think Bård mentioned at the beginning, the elephant in the room is really the climate change and the fact that the atmosphere has limited space for emissions. So there again, the space for emissions, I think you can also think of as a conservation good. So those are my thoughts.
Thanks, Bob. And you had a question in there about PFPs and some of those mechanisms. So maybe we'll turn it to you, Bård, to answer Bob's question to start.
No, thanks a lot for both for all the comments and very good insight that you added here. Yeah, so one thing which Bob was mentioning was that the complicated structure, because I simplified a lot, like there was a North and the South, and the North is paying the South, and that's it. But of course, in reality, it's super complicated because you have not only because you have many northern countries, but especially that there is not a single player in the South. There is a regime, their political system. There are districts which is managed or controlled very weakly, maybe by the national governments, and then you have farmers on the ground. And I think there are many different interesting challenges which arises when you make the situation or the game more complicated, but include more players. For example, one thing I didn't talk about at all, and I think that might be related to some of the challenges that could arise, Bob, was about illegal deforestation. I was talked as if the South could perfectly decide to conserve or log. But in reality, what they can do is to maybe strengthen the legal system and to reduce the probability that there will be illegal logging, for example. And illegal logging is different, but it can also be to some extent similar to the games that we have discussed today. For example, it can lead to leakage, but of a different type. Like if one region or district cracks down on crime, then that crime might pop up in a different district. That crime dislocation is very well known from the literature on law and economics, where policing one part of the town or the city, that can lead to more criminality elsewhere because the criminal activity will move. And I think that that can lead to like a type of leakage. Also, if, for example, it means that there is a lot of illegal logging in part of Brazil or in part of South America, and if one district or country cracks down on it, it can lead to, again, higher timber prices, and that can motivate more illegal logging elsewhere. It's different game. There are things which are similar to what we have talked about now, like leakage, but it leads to many more questions. So I cannot give fairness, I think, to these questions. I could maybe mention one thing which was related to what both Bob and Richard talked about, and that was on the carbon, because Bob mentioned that the big elephant in the room is carbon, and Richard was mentioning carbon, the trade of carbon credits, where, for example, one polluter is paying another polluter to get the right to pollute, so that they pollute less, but you get the right to pollute instead. So one way of dealing with conservation, beyond what we have, these payments we talked about, is to link conservation in a trading program where I can, if I'm a polluter, I can maybe get the right to pollute more if I pay, for example, Brazil to conserve more forest. Instead of paying them to pollute less, I can pay them to consume more forest. So if you link forest in a trading program or in a trading system, that is also one way of motivating conservation and payments from other countries. But I think one important thing to do to include in such a system, and in fact that might be well, like on the next COP meeting next year, it will be in Brazil. So in Brazil, we'll probably propose something like this. But I think one thing to be important there is to recognize that conserving forest is more than conserving fossil and carbon, because it also conserves biodiversity. So one could then take that into account by having some kind of a exchange rate, where if I conserve forest, I get more than one credit for doing that compared to if I conserve fossil fuel, because I also conserve biodiversity. So I care, I make two benefits to some extent. If I pay for conservation of forest, I conserve both carbon, and you can get an estimate for how much that is, and also biodiversity. And that should give some kind of that could lead to some kind of an exchange rate, which can take that into account when you decide a trading system that includes forest conservation. So,
Bård,
Go ahead.
one point that you might want to consider in the research, especially with regard to illegal logging and damage to the rainforests, things like that, which don't get executed, although they were paid for. What we did and what's done in the grain markets is to have a band of deliverable standards, right? So you have infestation, water damage, protein content, and when you trade wheat and commodities like that. So what we did with soil sequestration, take a 5-year period, haircutted it, only gave the payment 80%. At the end of the period, you go back and have the person who is charged with the conservation can true it up and get the other 20% once you verified there's been no landslides, no illegal logging, etc. But you build in incentives for future payments based upon them getting paid a little bit less. And that seemed to work very well with farmers and some of the projects that we did in Central America and South America.
thank you. That's a very interesting point.
So Bård, we have a question from the audience, from Magnus Ellerhaus. and forgive me, Magnus, if I didn't pronounce your last name properly. But the question's really about divergent trade policy and environmental regulation, because the EU is starting to stand out against the US and others on trade, on environmental regulations broadly. And it's a question then of how would we see the reshaping of trade dynamics, particularly in manufacturing and heavy industry, but how could this lead to cost differences for producers, and then maybe connect that to your research on how trade agreements could have an impact on conservation.
Yeah, thanks. That's a very good point. I think for climate change, it might be even more important to link to trade agreements than for the conservation of biodiversity, because so much more money will be required to compensate southern countries and reluctant countries to participate in a climate agreement than the liquidity that we have available. And also, we don't have so many other carrots or sticks that we can use to motivate countries to participate in climate agreements or cooperation on reducing emissions, carbon, and conserve for fossil fuel. So I think that because we have so little like cash and liquidity and carrots and sticks available, we must look carefully on what we have available, and trade policies might be some of the few sticks and carrots that we have. And European policies right now is to use the so-called CBAM. So that is a kind of a system where you impose tariffs on all products coming into Europe if those products have not already been subject to a tariff in their home country, in a carbon tax in their home country. So if the products are coming from a country who is already having a carbon tax at a level which is comparable to what it is inside Europe, there is no tariff. But if it's coming from a country without that carbon tax, then when that country is imported into Europe, then the producer or the importer must pay an additional tariff to reflect the carbon tax that it was not subject to. And I think that is a policy which will be interesting to follow, because it's probably going to develop now in this situation with more tariffs imposed by the Trump administration, because Europe and other countries will react by considering their own tariffs, and the European tariffs now are very much linked to what in the CBAM policy is very much linked to how much other countries or how much other producers are taxing their goods when it comes to carbon. And so it could be a little bit interesting to see if the European response to the tariffs that are introduced by the US will be to use CBAM. And I think that so far it's an open question. But of course, the idea of that policy is to make it there are several motivations for it, but one motivation for it is to make it more comparable for the consumers in Europe when they consider to buy from a product or a good that is produced within Europe or a product that is exported into Europe. If only the product within Europe has been subject to a tax on carbon, then of course that will be more expensive. So to make it more fair, then that's one of the ideas. But the hope is also, in addition to that, the hope is also that it can motivate other countries to just as well introduce their own carbon taxes, so that they don't have to be subject to those tariffs.
Thanks, Bart. Bob, Richard, any thoughts?
Well, go ahead, Richard.
No, go ahead, Bob. Let me follow you.
Well, I was going to say to Bart, it sounds like a path that could lead to a global equilibrium where everyone has carbon prices. Is that something that you could see happening?
I think it's I think part of the motivation for the Europe's CBAM is that the hope is that it can motivate countries to introduce their own tariffs, and whether it's strong enough to actually make sure that will happen in reality maybe it might be questionable, especially in the short term. But in the long term, I think that you need to introduce tariffs or trade in some form and connect that to what countries are doing on climate change, because we don't have enough cash to use or other sticks or carrots to use instead.
I think Bob asked a great question, and I would respond or be thinking about the fact that as I understand CBAM, if you have your own domestic carbon price, that it doesn't apply. So I would think about an unintended consequence, having worked in China, that it wouldn't surprise me in the next year or two to have the Chinese start a carbon market and therefore find an exemption or an arbitrage around CBAMs, which would accomplish what you want, Bart, a global price of carbon, or as what Bob was talking about, it doesn't much matter if it's 40 euros on ice in London or $30 a ton in carbon in California, in a domestic system. So I think Bob's point was it could well establish and motivate a global price in carbon, and arbitrageurs will then, buy and sell and compress those international differences.
Well, I hope so.
As we hope, right?
Right. Well, and China, by the way, already has a carbon intensity standard, I think, which in effect is a carbon price. It doesn't apply to all goods and services, but I think they're actually planning to extend it this year, for instance, to steel and aluminum. And so if we're going to get ahead of the Chinese, we have to move quickly, I think.
Very interesting. So I have another question that sort of turns, Bard, your model a little bit on its head, which is, what if a country that is more interested in preserving, right, is also the poorer, smaller country, right? The one that has the resources. So let's say, some Caribbean island, and the rich country is the one that wants to exploit, right? How can the poor pay the rich to preserve, especially if preferences aren't symmetric across countries?
Yeah, that's a very good point, and it's a much more difficult situation. And that could be relevant in many cases, because I talked about the North as someone paying for conservation, as if the North is the World Bank or Norway, who's paying a lot of conservation on forest, or Germany and UK, who is already paying. But it could be, you also know that much of the extraction of resources, for example, in Africa now, is funded by, for example, China, who is paying to get extraction rights and not necessarily for conservation, and to reduce that activity. I think it might be, of course, if it's within one's own countries, one can do it, right? Because then one can maybe try to regulate and introduce laws. But it might be difficult because policymakers are interested in the compensation they get if they open up land or resources for extraction. And if you don't have enough or anything to pay for in return, I think it's complicated. One could maybe then try to make coalitions. So one thing I started out by talking about in the beginning was the importance and the benefit of making coalitions among those or different countries to conserve. And I think that if you are small and poor, I think that these kind of coalitions can be especially important and probably necessary.
Bob, Richard, anything to add? No? Okay, great. Then go ahead, Bob.
Well, I just think that it is important to think about these coalitions and whether or not you can actually use such a coalition then to force countries that are not part of the coalition to change their policy and to join the coalition and ultimately protect these public goods. I think it's also interesting to think about when free trade, we always think about free trade as being a good thing, but here's an example where free trade, as Bard pointed out, can lead to less conservation, additional pressure on conservation. So it's also interesting to think about what ultimately would be the right trade standards ultimately to get to equilibrium with conservation.
No,
But
absolutely.
I would score that point, and you know, I think the economics profession, we were always taught that free trade was good, and we're now realizing maybe we should have put some guardrails about it and prevented income inequality, dispersions of wealth, that we went head on into a world of free trade without putting guardrails on. So I think the point you make is really important, and it's really important because of income distribution and income inequalities and the social problems that created. Maybe we can learn from some of those mistakes and not do it again in conservation.
Yeah, it's such an important point because these externalities are not brought up very often as trade is discussed, you know, even in, the general audience of New York Times, Wall Street Journal, et cetera. It's very rarely brought up, the negative impact of trade. So more work to be done on guardrails around trade and what that means for, you know, sustainable development goals, probably broadly, but certainly conservation. Another question that came from our audience really does get to, call it, the political situation maybe we're in today too. So could just political and regime uncertainty, which we are clearly in a time of uncertainty, it could undermine long-term agreements and treaties and undermine credibility. So how could this be addressed in the context where one president could, for example, sign an executive order and eliminate agreements? So how do you manage in that sort of, uncertain political environment? And I might open it up to Richard and Bob for this question because you're both, very active in efforts to fund conservation and to create investment mechanisms, et cetera, that can work on behalf of these efforts. So, Richard, maybe we go to you for your thoughts first.
Go ahead, Bob. Let me.
Okay, Bob.
You.
Go right ahead.
Well, I would just reiterate, what I was saying before, which is that these attempts to create conservation have led to, they've been going on for decades, and they've led to some learnings. One of which is that you do have to focus on permanence, and the institutions and organizations that are going to be around a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades from now, because conservation is a it's a one-way door. You go through it and you're done. So we've got to have that focus on the long term, and then getting all of the stakeholders. We talked about that as well. In the Amazon, there's tens of millions of indigenous folks that are living there and trying to scrape out livelihoods. So how do you protect their interests as well as the interests both domestically from the government and other organizations, and then also from the international community? The benefits from conservation, some of them are very local, clean water. Others, biodiversity, are kind of global. And so it's hard to figure out who's getting those benefits, hard to quantify them. it's all very complicated. I would just put it that way.
Yeah, Jessica, Bob and I agree on so many things, and this is one of them. And we were chatting on the side. Clearly, we've been following and working in the voluntary market, for whatever, 35 years. And the first lesson that we learn as somebody who's been involved in a world of commodities is standardization. And this is the major problem. It is why the Board of Trade began in 1848. It decided that, and the standards don't have to be perfect. And very often, the environmental groups look for perfection where they should be looking for good. And I think a homogeneous set of standards, what does conservation mean? And the more you can get a critical matter, then you can trade it. And once you can create liquidity in standards, it tends to have the multiplier that Bard's talking about, that liquidity, that standardization, that agreement. What is forest preservation? What does it mean? And can 10 financial players agree with each other, or 10 nations agree with each other? This is what we mean by it. Then the gains from trade can occur. But without standardizing, then it's very hard to realize the gains for trade. And so my thoughts would be that's where it all begins. What is wheat? What is water conservation? What is forest preservation? And do we agree on the standards? Once we agree on the standards, then we can proceed to have contracting. But without, and as Bard said, with that, you need unambiguous property rights in the Coasian sense. So it's standardization and then unambiguous contract rights. And once you can get those things going, then you can proceed to the next step.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And sometimes in these markets, we talk about a jurisdictional approach, which is just to say governments need to get involved in order to set and enforce these standards. That was certainly the direction we were going under Russ Benham at the CFTC. And I hope we continue that at some point in the future.
It's also interesting to note, just as one last aside, the Board of Trade came up with grain standards. It was somewhere around after it began in 1848. It took the United States government more than 50 years to adopt those standards and become the USDA. So sometimes the private sector needs to get started so there's something for the government to ratify, as opposed to the government being the R&D.
Well, we have the Integrity Council for the voluntary carbon market.
Exactly.
I hope we don't have to wait 50 years.
No, neither do I.
So I have a question for Bob and Richard, but also for you, Bard, about much of the research that you talked about today and a lot of our discussion has such an important role for government, right? So government is really a primary actor. But I think with regime change and uncertainty, the question is, are there other actors who become more and more important? And one of those is pools of philanthropic capital. Philanthropic capital is now funding the UN GCCC. And there are other organizations, that have been multilateral government organizations, but now are really bringing in private pools of capital to, for impact. And, it's a question, I guess, for all of you. Is that a new actor that we should be thinking about in, this, I guess, in solving conservation? And what should we be thinking might happen in the future with some of these organizations?
Well, I'll take a crack at that, Jessica. I mean, I think philanthropic capital is very important, has been very important, along with government funding. But when we talk about the big issue here, which is really, I think, carbon emissions, we need to move more quickly in terms of the investments that we have in low carbon capital. And it can't be motivated simply by government funding and philanthropic capital. It has to be motivated by profit, by the for-profit sector, which is to say that until we put a price on carbon, we're not going to get adequate investment. Bloomberg new economic finance or new energy finance, that's what they estimate. I think now that it's $2.1 trillion annually in low carbon investment, and we need to get to 5. So there's a real gap between the speed at which we're transforming the economy and the speed that we need to. And that's got to rely on the private sector. It can't be philanthropic capital alone or government funding. There's just not enough.
Richard?
Yeah, I think you need the beat the same horse. You need the not-for-profit world to develop standards. It's going on now as in the voluntary market, that's where the danger with philanthropic capital, it's like coaching a group of 8-year-old girls or boys in a team. You tell them to go in one direction, they all scramble and they chase the ball, and they forget that they have positions on first and second and third base. And so the philanthropic capital goes into ESG, and nobody quite knows what it is, and they all flow into it without any defined goal. And so it isn't very objective, specific in what it does. But I think that somehow the World Wildlife Fund, WRI, the ones who Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, it's got to come up with a set of different tools, whether it's easements or standards, but separate goals, as opposed to getting the group of 11-year-olds to go in, and play their position. It doesn't work if you try to harness them as a group. Having said that, this is going to be the greatest transfer of wealth in the history of the world. And that philanthropic capital has got to be harnessed appropriately, and it can't be some officer who is a project manager to do it on an ad hoc basis. It's not going to solve, as Bob said, the macro problem. It's just, you can't organize it.
Yeah, and that question of how do you incent private capital in the long run, Bob, I think is absolutely private capital will go into conservation if the economics are right. And that the question is, how do you create the right incentives, the right returns, and mitigate risk? What are the options to mitigate risk in these circumstances? So Bard, maybe any final comments from you as we get to the close here, and I turn it back over to Tom. So go ahead.
Thanks. One thing which is related to this is something that economists often talk about, which is multiple equilibria. An equilibria is something stable, and for example, we might have a bad equilibrium where we have too little investments in green technology and too much investments in fossil fuel. And that means that those who have vested interest in the fossil fuel, they support a government and to lobby government who is running a policy that is favorable to them, and who are then preventing a policies that could be favorable to green investments. That is one equilibrium. But there is also another equilibrium, which is that there are more investments in green technologies and in more renewables, and that could create businesses and vested interests who will pressure the government to run a policy which is more environmentally friendly and therefore profitable to those vested interests. And I think that one of the ideas about the Inflation Reduction Act was to subsidize investments in green technologies so that we could create a group of investors who had a vested interest in continued environmental policy. And I think that that could be one hope, even if the current administration in the US is not a big fan of environmental policy. Like there are vested interests who have already invested in environmental friendly technologies, in renewables, in solar technology, in windmills, electric cars, and so on. And some of that, those investments will increase as long as the Inflation Reduction Act has some bite, and that can create, a very important role for private investors to influence the policies that can be run in the government.
Okay, that's
Thank
very
you.
good.
We
Thank
need
you,
more
Bob.
skin in the game. So Tom, over to you.
Yeah, well, thanks. Well, first of all, I want to thank Jessica for the wonderful job moderating, and our panelists, Bob and Richard, and of course, Bard, for the wonderful lecture you've given. And let me just do a shout out for our staff for the wonderful job, pulling this thing off. And so let's just give a round of applause for what I think is a wonderful event. So thank you again. Thank you all of you on Zoom, and we appreciate your participation. And for those in person, we have some refreshments outside, and we can chat a little bit more about such an important issue. So thank you again, everyone.